I have watched a man plow 40 acres in a single day with 2 horses and a walking plow. No engine, no fuel, no breakdown waiting to happen at the worst possible moment. Just 2 animals, 1 man, and a method that has worked continuously for longer than anyone reading this has been alive. And here is what struck me about it. Not the spectacle of it, though it is something to see. What struck me was how quiet it was. You could hear the soil turning. You could hear the harness creak. There was no noise drowning out the work, just the work itself, moving forward at exactly the pace the land required. I am going to show you, in the next 18 minutes, how Old Order Amish families manage a full 100 acres of working farmland without a single drop of gasoline. Not as a curiosity, not as nostalgia. As a functioning system, one I have observed across 8 decades of living beside these families, watching what they built, watching what held, and watching what they kept building long after the English moved on to other things. Stay with me until the end, because the last piece of this system is the one that makes everything else possible. And it is the one modern agriculture forgot almost completely. The first thing you have to understand is that a draft horse is not a substitute for a tractor. It is a different category of machine entirely, one that reproduces, that maintains its own fuel supply from the land it works, and that has been doing this job continuously for 2 centuries without a single factory producing a replacement part. The families I grew up beside kept Belgian and Percheron horses almost exclusively. Both breeds pull between 1,600 and 2,200 pounds of animal. A well-conditioned Belgian in regular work will pull a load equal to roughly its own body weight across a full working day. And it will do that day after day, season after season, for 15 to 20 years of useful farm life. Now compare that to a tractor. A mid-size row crop tractor costs between $80,000 and $120,000 new. It depreciates the moment it leaves the lot. It requires diesel, hydraulic fluid, filters, belts, tires, and a mechanic with computerized diagnostic equipment when something goes wrong, which it will. The horse requires hay, oats, water, and a person who knows how to read an animal. The families I watched kept a working team of 4 to 6 horses for a 100-acre operation. 2 horses in the field, 2 resting, rotating through the week. The feed for those horses, the hay, the oats, the pasture, came almost entirely from the farm itself. A portion of every acre worked went back into feeding the animals that worked it. That is a closed loop that no diesel engine has ever replicated. One thing experienced horsemen will tell you: a draft horse is not low maintenance. Hoof care, harness fitting, veterinary attention, these are real costs and real skills. The Amish families I observed invested heavily in knowing their animals. A poorly fitted collar will destroy a horse's shoulder in a single season. The knowledge of how to fit, adjust, and read a working horse is as technical as any mechanical skill. It is simply older. What I watched over 60 winters of observation is that the families who kept this knowledge sharp never lost a working season to a breakdown they could not fix themselves. That is a form of resilience that has no price tag. 100 acres managed without machinery is not managed the same way 100 acres managed with machinery is. The field layout is different. The rotation is different. The relationship between the soil and the animals and the crops is different in ways that took me years of watching to fully understand. The Old Order families I grew up beside divided their 100 acres roughly as follows, and I want to be careful here, because every farm is slightly different, but the proportions held remarkably consistent across the farms I observed. Approximately 30 to 35 acres in row crops, primarily corn and potatoes. 30 acres in hay, a mix of timothy, clover, and alfalfa in rotation. 20 acres in small grains, primarily oats and wheat, 10 to 15 acres in permanent pasture, the remaining acreage in woodlot, garden, and orchard. That breakdown is not arbitrary. The hay ground feeds the horses and the cattle. The oats feed the horses directly. The corn feeds the hogs and the family. The small grain straw beds the animals through winter. Every acre is connected to every other acre through the animals that move between them. Nothing is isolated. Nothing is grown purely for cash without also serving the farm's internal economy. What modern agriculture replaced with chemical inputs, this system replaced with rotation and animal integration. The clover in the hay rotation fixes nitrogen. The cattle and horses grazing the pasture deposit fertility. The manure from the barn goes back to the field in spring. I watched this cycle operate on the same ground for 60 years. The soil did not degrade. In several cases, I observed it visibly improved, darker, looser, richer, across the span of a generation. If you have ever tried to manage even 5 acres without inputs and felt the ground going thin on you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you are working with, because what I am describing is not theory. It is what I watched function on this ground, in this climate, across decades. Nobody talks about manure management as a system. They talk about it as a problem, something to dispose of, something to manage away. The families I watched treated it as the most valuable product on the farm. And across 8 decades of observation, I believe they were right. A single draft horse produces roughly 50 pounds of manure per day. A cow produces closer to 65. A 100-acre farm running 6 horses, 8 cattle, and a modest hog operation is generating somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds of raw fertility every single day of the year. The question is not whether you have enough fertility. The question is whether you have a system to move it where it needs to go at the right time. The system I watched operated in 3 stages. First, the barn, animals bedded on straw through winter, manure accumulating in the stalls and pack. Second, the manure pile, a designated area outside the barn, sheltered from direct rain where possible, where the pack was moved and allowed to heat and break down through late winter. Third, the field, spread by horse-drawn manure, spreader in early spring before planting, incorporated by the first tillage pass. The timing mattered. Spreading too early in a wet spring meant runoff and loss. Spreading too late meant the nitrogen had already volatilized. The families I observed spread when the ground was firm enough to carry the horse and spreader without compaction, and before the soil temperature had risen enough to drive off the ammonia fraction. That window, in the climate I grew up in, was roughly a 3-week period in March and early April. They hit it every year. Not because they had weather apps, because they had been watching the same fields respond to the same conditions for generations. This is the kind of knowledge that does not transfer easily to a manual. It transfers by watching someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone else. That chain, on the farms I knew, was unbroken. Before I get to the next piece of this system, I want to say something directly. If you have made it this far, and this is landing differently than you expected, if you are realizing this is not a primitive system, it is a sophisticated one, leave a like right now, so I know this kind of depth is what you want more of. Water is the constraint that ends most off-grid farming attempts. You can manage without electricity. You can manage without fuel. You cannot manage 100 acres of livestock and crops without a reliable, high-volume water supply. The Amish families I observed solved this problem before I was born, and they solved it without a single electric pump. The tool at the center of this system is the hydraulic ram pump, a device that uses the momentum of falling water to push a small fraction of that water uphill to a storage tank with no external power source whatsoever. A ram pump with a 4-foot fall and adequate flow can push water 60 to 100 feet uphill, continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for decades, with no moving parts beyond 2 check valves. The farms I watched that had a reliable spring or creek on their property installed ram pumps as a matter of course. The water rose to a storage tank positioned high enough on the property to gravity feed the barn, the house, and the garden through buried wooden or later iron pipe. The system required no attention beyond occasional valve inspection. I watched one of these installations run for 30 years without a service call. For farms without a spring, the solution was a hand-dug well positioned uphill from the barn with a hand pump and a gravity-fed cistern that collected roof runoff for garden irrigation. The cistern was the backup. The spring or well was the primary. Between the two, I never watched a family run short of water in a dry summer, and we had dry summers. Here is something I did not fully understand until I had watched it for 20 years. The horse does not just pull the implement. The horse changes the soil it walks on differently than a tractor does, and that difference compounds over decades in ways that show up in the crop. A tractor exerts ground pressure measured in pounds per square inch. A large row crop tractor running on firm ground exerts between 14 and 25 psi across its tire contact area. A Belgian draft horse with its wide, spreading hoof exerts roughly 14 to 16 psi across a much smaller footprint and similar to a walking human, and far below the threshold at which soil structure begins to collapse. What this means in practice is that the tillage zone stays open. The capillary channels that move water and air through the soil profile, the ones earthworms build and roots follow, are not crushed shut by the passage of the working animal. I watched fields that had been horse-farmed continuously. For 3 generations hold water differently after a heavy rain than neighboring fields that had been under tractor cultivation for the same period. The horse-farmed ground absorbed. The tractor-farmed ground ran off. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not claiming tractor farming is wrong. I am telling you what I observed on specific fields over specific decades. Soil is complex and every farm is different. But what I watched consistently was this. The fields that had never seen a tractor tire had a different feel underfoot, softer, more alive. And the yields on those fields, in the drought years especially, held steadier than the fields around them. The Amish families I knew did not talk about soil compaction in those terms. They talked about whether the ground worked right, whether it opened up clean in spring, whether it held moisture through July. That is the same thing, described by people who learned it by feel before the science caught up with the observation. What I have shown you so far is the horses, the rotation, the manure system, the water, the tillage. These are the foundation. But the system I am describing has 2 more pieces that hold everything together. And the second to last one is the piece that surprised me most when I finally understood what I was looking at. If this kind of depth, real methods, real numbers, real observation across decades is what you come here for, subscribe now. This is what we do every single week, and what comes next is the part most people never think to ask about. The bank barn is not just a building, it is a passive climate system designed to keep animals alive through winter without supplemental heat, store a year's worth of feed in a single structure, and use the body heat of the animals themselves to moderate the temperature above the frost line. The design is specific, and it is not accidental. The barn is built into a hillside, the bank, so that the lower level, where the animals winter, is partially below grade on 3 sides. Earth is the insulator. The upper level, the threshing floor and hay mow, sits above and acts as a thermal cap. The packed hay itself holding warmth that radiates slowly downward through the winter months. I grew up around bank barns that were built in the mid-1800s. Some of those barns are still standing and still in use. The timber frames, white oak, hand-hewn, joined with wooden pegs, have outlived multiple generations of the families that built them. The design has not changed in 2 centuries because it did not need to. The animal heat inside a well-stocked bank barn is substantial. 6 horses and 8 cattle generate enough metabolic heat to keep the lower level above freezing through a Pennsylvania winter without a single supplemental heat source. I watched this work through winters that dropped to 0 Fahrenheit for weeks at a stretch. The animals were not comfortable by modern standards. They were healthy. There is a difference, and the Amish families I knew understood it precisely. The hay in the loft was not just feed, it was the insulating mass that made the whole system work. A full hay mow in November, packed tight floor to roof, holds enough thermal mass to moderate the barn's internal temperature swing by 10 to 15 degrees through a cold snap. The families I watched never let the mow go empty before winter. That was not carelessness they could afford. Here is the piece that took me the longest to understand, and I think it is the piece that most people who admire this system miss entirely when they try to replicate it on their own. No single Amish family manages 100 acres alone. The system I have been describing is not a solo operation. It is a community operation, and the community is as much a part of the infrastructure as the barn or the horses or the ram pump. The barn raising is the image people know. 40 men appear on a Tuesday morning, and a barn that would take a contractor 6 months to frame is standing by Thursday evening. That is real. I watched it happen more times than I can count, but the barn raising is just the most visible expression of a labor-sharing system that operates continuously, quietly, across every season. Planting season, harvest, threshing, butchering, roofing, fencing. Every task that requires more labor than a single family can provide is handled through a reciprocal network that has no formal contract, no payment schedule, and no written agreement. You show up for your neighbor shows up for you. That exchange has operated continuously in the communities I grew up beside for as long as anyone can remember. What this means practically is that a 100-acre farm can execute tasks at a scale and speed that would be impossible for a family working alone without machinery. The threshing crew that moves from farm to farm in August, the planting neighbors who arrive with their own teams to help get the corn in before rain, the women who appear in a kitchen when there is canning to do. This is the labor system. The horses are the power system. Together they replace the tractor, the combine, the grain dryer, and the hired hand. I want to be honest about something because experienced viewers will push back on this, and they should. This system is not easily replicated by someone living outside that community structure. The labor network took generations to build. The trust that underlies it is not something you can manufacture in a season. If you are drawn to this model and wondering how to apply it to your own situation, the answer is not to buy draft horses tomorrow. The answer is to start building the relationships. The horses come later. The community has to come first. That is the piece modern homesteaders most often skip, and it is the piece that explains why so many attempts to replicate this system fall short. The technology is learnable in a year. The community takes a lifetime. If that landed for you, if you have been trying to do this alone and you felt something shift just now, tell me in the comments, because I think that is the conversation worth having. You have stayed with me through the whole system, the horses, the rotation, the water, the soil, the barn, and now the community. That is not a casual viewer. That is someone who actually wants to understand how this works. If you want more of this, real observation, real numbers, real methods that quietly outlive the alternatives, subscribe now. This is what we build here week after week. And there is more in this world than one video can hold. 100 acres, no gasoline, still working. That is not a miracle. It is a system built piece by piece across 2 centuries, and it is still standing on these farms today. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more videos in the same world. Thanks for being here. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you.